The journey to come and listen to me. I'm going to share some reflections about the churches, and not just the churches, the faith community's response to Grenfell. Inevitably, that doesn't say everything about what's been going on, and probably skirting over some of the things that have happened. And really, I suppose, from my point of view now, 2 years on almost from the fire, wanted to spend a bit more time, not so much on what the churches and the faith community did immediately after the fire, but what some of the longer term issues are for our local community, because those are the things on my mind. But I'm very happy to be sidetracked by you. If there are particular areas that you want to ask about, which I'm not talking about, please, when it comes to it, please go ahead. I don't want this to be unduly formal or anything like that. If I can just by words of introduction, some of you may know West London and this part of the world. This is what Grenfell Tower looks like today. If you can't see the pictures, nothing I'm going to say here is vital that you'll miss out if you can't see any of the slides. Grenfell Tower has been shrouded for a long time, and we are much better off with it being hidden from view for all kinds of reasons. But it has been a grotesque sight, and we don't really like pictures of the tower being shown now. In the immediate aftermath, it was important that the tower was seen because people wanted to know the full horror of what had happened and wanted the story to be remembered, particularly, of course, the bereaved, who still want this to be nothing that will ever be forgotten. And indeed, some of them didn't want the tower to be shrouded and wanted it to be left as a very public and very ugly monument to what has happened. For the local community, that's just unbearable, and so it has been shrouded. But in the immediate aftermath, this is what it looked like. The reason I show you this picture, which you can be sure I didn't take because it's taken from a helicopter, it just shows you something of the local community. North Kensington is a very densely populated part of London. It is one of the wealthiest boroughs, if not the wealthiest borough in the British Isles. It has vast reserves of wealth and prosperity. It's also one of containing some of the very poorest wards as well, and not much in between. It is an area of very stark difference, which exists cheek by jowl, sometimes in the same street, and sometimes indeed as neighbours. So, whatever your state, you are very aware that other people live a very different life from you, whether you are much more prosperous or you're far less prosperous. That's the reality. It's a very diverse area, and I haven't brought all the maps to bore you with the stats. You can look on the RBKC website. It will show you lots of those indices of things like unemployment and poverty and overcrowding and so on. It's also a very diverse ethnic mix of people, which from my point of view makes it a fascinating and brilliant place to live and to work. Significant proportion of the immediate population near Grenfell Tower are Muslim. It's also an area where a very significantly high proportion of people have a faith of any kind, which is significant perhaps for what has happened. For much of my career as a minister, I'm the kind of person who will, if I want a seat on a train, I put my dog collar on. If you want to be left alone, you look like a vicar or a priest, and you know you won't be bothered. If you are bothered, you don't want the kind of bother that's going to come your way. In the aftermath of Grenfell, the way that I and other people in the faith community is viewed is entirely different, and it is both humbling and startling. To recognise that that's not about me as a person. That's about the regard that people have for established faith organisations and a faith community, which is probably rather different from the rest of the British Isles, perhaps. Anyway, the Methodist Church, where I am church minister, is just down there on the left-hand side. If I just squeeze across, I'll point it out to you. It is just there. I'll say that again. It is just there. And that's about 150 yards door to door from Grenfell Tower, past the modern school and leisure centre. And much of the local area is built in the immediate vicinity of Grenfell Tower are housing estates. And it is, as I said, a very densely populated area indeed. Very little green space as well, and a history of political radicalism and of people, and of protest, and of people feeling ignored, which I'll say more about in due course, for a number of reasons to do with big development plans and projects that have, as the local population would see it, been imposed on them by people who don't represent them. That's how they would see it. So the building of a big motorway through the local estate, the demolition of local housing estates, the building of an unpopular school, which took years to construct. All these things are part of that narrative, which is added what's happened with Grenfell Tower. After the Grenfell Tower fire, one of the features, of course, was the huge outpouring of shock and horror and grief, understandably, and lament, which has manifested itself in all kinds of ways. People bringing flowers is perhaps common. People bringing all kinds of other mementos as well, which creates down the line its own issues. Issues for us in terms of how those items are then preserved, many of which are left outside the Methodist Church. And some are more appropriate than others, let me say that in my view. And one of my jobs' interest is to police the difficult kind of navigating of how to police what is a very sensitive and important memorial. But of course, at the outset, lots of people felt the urge, both near and far away, to come and to write things and to lay flowers. And people filled boards and boards and boards outside. This is one of the other churches, in fact, with things that they wanted simply to express. And it said something to us who were staggered by the volume of this, about how helpful it can be for people to have some outlet, some tangible outlet for how people feel, more than perhaps decades ago people in this country would have done by perhaps going to say prayers or lighting a candle possibly. Whereas now we have people wanting to create works of art and graffiti and condolence books and so many other things. We have scores and scores of filled condolence books. We don't know what to do with them, but that's in a sense not the point. But for people who wrote in them, they find it helpful. And at the second anniversary, in a few weeks' time, there will be more things that will be written and filled out. And people will value the opportunity to be able to do that. And places like churches and mosques seem to be the places that people go to for such things, even if they don't regard themselves as being particularly religious. People expect that of us, and are grateful when we are able to offer it, however well or however poorly we do it. One of the features of the local area is the interesting graffiti. I'll show you a few aspects of it. This has been slightly modified since I took the photo a long time ago now, so the date is now the 14th and not the 13th. But the sign is huge. It's about 25 feet high, and is built underneath the Westway, the local motorway. A lot of religious graffiti, text from the Quran and the Bible. Not many places where you would expect to find huge chunks of the scriptures used as protest or as words of comfort for the local population, but that is what people have done. So a few examples: texts from Proverbs, Psalm 72, blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. And most of these are still visible in the local area, by the way. I am the resurrection and the life. A version of Psalm 61. And some of the more interesting political graffiti that emerges from time to time. And the local authority are more wise to this now, and they do remove these things fairly quickly after they've appeared, but they still emerge from time to time as well. That's taken just outside the church. One of the things we were given was a big granite statue that is 7 foot tall, and actually, because it is very kind of, to me, a kind of brutalist work of art, it seems strangely fitting for what has happened. And I've always said it reminds me of the text about Rachel weeping for her children from Jeremiah, quoted in Matthew's Gospel. And so we've named her Rachel, and she now has a permanent position outside our church. So there's that sense of helping people to lament and find expression for all those things that are inside when very difficult things happen, and things which sometimes defy explanation or description, simply because of the scale of what has happened. And anybody who remembers the Grenfell Tower fire, or who was there, remembers just the huge sense of, I can't believe this is happening. It is so appalling, and not least in Britain and in a city like London, to have such a monstrous tragedy like this taking place. The faith community, as has been well documented, were one of the main pivots of a kind of humanitarian and relief response, not because we particularly set out to do it, but because we ended up being used. Now, we probably got off quite well in the press from that point of view, but in the main, it was the community wanting to do something and seeing local faith organisations and churches in particular as allies, as people who would be on side, as people who could be asked and who could be trusted to do certain things, particularly in an area where there aren't very many other good community organisations or community networks that are able to deliver things or have good resources. So many of the churches were used as places for assistance over the first few days and weeks, where we were overwhelmed with goods and donations, much of which, of course, we had never asked for. In the first day, a lot of blankets and food and water and other items, nappies and stuff, were really useful. There were also many things that were not so useful, shall I say, and I nearly constructed a wall of shame like they have at Calais in the refugee camp there for some of the things that we really did not have a clue what to do with, and felt that people were simply turfing out the things they didn't want. That sounds a bit ungrateful, I know, but we were the people who had to end up sorting them and then actually finding out what you do with them in due course. Muslim Aid produced a report. I forget now when, it was many months after the fire, and if you can't read that, I simply quote it to say that it's a way of saying that the Muslim and Christian organisations played critical leadership roles in the Grenfell response and offered trusted expert assistance to local communities. And I want to cling on to that because I think it suggests ways in which faith communities, even sometimes when we consider ourselves to be small, fragile, beleaguered faith communities, nonetheless are able to contribute significantly to community life. We have what is called social capital. We have resources and networks and things at our disposal which can make a huge difference. Like having a building where you've got power sockets, and you've got warm spaces which are comfortable, and you've got good clean toilets. Those things are still very much appreciated. And of course, a place where people know that they are going to be received well, made to feel welcome. There's a sense of privacy and a sense of respect and dignity and all those kind of things, to allow people to express themselves, to be quiet, to shout a bit, to go and pray, and all those kinds of things that people may feel they need to do. Alan Everett, who's the local vicar, wrote a book called After the Fire, and he makes I suppose a rather similar comment, which talks about people needing to, about halfway down, to find recognised places of safety, and those who turned up for help needed to find themselves in the presence of others like themselves, to whom they could easily relate. In times of crisis, places of worship and community centres are ideally both in and of the areas they serve. I think that's really quite important. Just a list of some of the things that the faith community was involved in the immediate aftermath. Our premises were used hugely, and certainly in the Methodist Church, we were overrun for many months by impromptu meetings, because we had to be in the location we were. So the forensic crews and the police and the coroner used us most days for the first 6 months. The police used us a lot because they wanted to have nice toilets. And they didn't have the forensics crews, they didn't have hot food for weeks. And at best they've got some fairly ramshackle porter cabins. And they had no meeting space, so being able to come over to our place was helpful. Having a postal address. The Grenfell recovery site has no postal address. So if deliveries need to be made, they cannot be made to that location. They have to be made to our church instead. And then they'll come over the road and collect it and take it over to their site. And small but significant things, which also hopefully conveys to people doing that arduous work, the support and the concern that we have for them as well. Huge numbers of consultations with the police, the NHS, the local authority, and as I'll come to say in a minute, some very, very angry meetings with the local community. Obviously involved in funeral events, memorial events. Every 14th there is a silent march around the local neighbourhood that still takes place. Meets at 7 o'clock from the Methodist Church, and we are now making plans for the 2nd anniversary to take place in June, 6 or 7 weeks' time from now. And the march has between several hundred and at most several thousand people who take part in it and walk silently for an hour. I've been on many Good Friday walks. I don't know if you go on these kinds of things. My experience, I have to say, is that there's usually somebody nattering in my ear as I'm walking around the streets following a cross somewhere. On these marches, you can hear a pin drop. And they are profoundly moving. They have not become, as we'd feared, politicised events. They are very much a memorial about those who've lost their lives, the 72 people. The St Paul's Cathedral service, again, I think, helped people have a sense of recognition of the enormity of what had happened, and also the inclusive way in which St Paul's Cathedral, I think very brilliantly, managed to incorporate so many different faith traditions. Only recently did I discover the flack that St Paul's staff had to deal with in the immediate days before the cathedral service from a very senior Anglican authority, whose name I shouldn't probably say, who was very unhappy about the fact that there was going to be, a Muslim girls' choir singing an Islamic song in St Paul's. What was interesting from my perspective is hearing the many Muslims that I knew coming out of St Paul's saying, could never believe this would ever happen. I feel so much, my feeling towards this country is so different now because of what's happened. And people felt, they felt taller as a result, strangely, of that service. This is in some ways, I think, repeating some of the things I said, simply about some of the practical responses that the church did or were involved in, and to an extent have been involved in ever since. One of the more difficult ones is what to do with money that you are given, and how to deal with it appropriately, when many of us are not skilled at sorting out an impromptu grant-making system consisting of thousands or perhaps tens and tens of thousands of pounds. We're getting better at it, but it can be quite overwhelming. On the day she retired, the local police chief, Ellie O'Connor, rang me up. She probably rang other people, but she rang me up and said, and I wrote this down, she was thanking us and said, "You are the quiet people who enable others to be angry and to be sad." And I love that quote. There's, I think, a real role for a faith community in helping people to express anger and to express sorrow. And both are important. And they need to move beyond, obviously, merely expressing those things. But in the first stages, it's about being able simply to let these things out, in order then that perhaps in time, things like healing and reconciliation and justice might be achieved. And we had some very ugly scenes outside our church and in the local community on the first few days. This was taken on the Friday afternoon, 2 days after the fire, when Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, paid a visit to the church. He'd come on the Wednesday and had been well received. He came back on the Friday and the mood was very different. It was very ugly. People were shouting at him from a distance as he was approaching the church. I didn't know he was coming, he just turned up. And there were a few coppers there, as you can see. My son took this picture from up in the building looking down. As he entered the building, people started throwing things at him. And so we had to barricade him inside the church for nearly an hour before they were able to get a lot more police to come and then escort him safely out of the building to wherever he was going to go on next. But certainly there was a huge amount of anger. We held quite a number of public meetings at the church, some of which broke up into acrimony. Some I chaired broke up into acrimony, and we just had to abandon the meetings. A local authority scrutiny committee about Grenfell was abandoned in our church last autumn when we had scuffles breaking out in the meeting. One of my church members, who's about this big and comes from Montserrat, came up to me and said, "Reverend, isn't it your job to do something about this?" I mean, I may have been, in all my theological training, sort of being a fighter on breaking up, being a bouncer or something was not part of my training. No, I would leave it, leave other people to do those kinds of things. But clearly those things are very difficult and distressing for many people, and that some of the many big angry meetings we've had, you wonder whether they've been helpful, because people get so incredibly stressed by the highly charged atmosphere. And yet at the same time, people feel that at least some of them are being listened to through that process. It's a difficult one, and maybe you have your own reflections on that. Just a few comments about the St Paul's service, which is there. It may not have been very obvious perhaps to the public, but we spent a lot of time working with the St Paul's staff about getting the organisation of the service done well, in contrast to a service that had been held there a few months before for those who had lost, I think it's the relatives of those who'd lost their lives in the conflict in Iraq and Afghanistan. In that service, the dignitaries sat at the front and the bereaved relatives sat behind. They had comments about that, and for this service, as you can see, on the front row are the bereaved and survivors. The politicians are further back, and the people from the police chiefs, the fire brigades, and many other officials are actually out of shot on their way over this side here in one of the transepts. And so the significance for them of being right at the front and centre stage, I think, was important. And in everything that's happened since, the police, the public inquiry, the local authority, national government and so on, have been very careful, I think, as much as they can be, to put the bereaved and survivors at the heart of everything that is being done, to be consulted constantly and to be informed about decisions that are being taken. That's just a picture on the steps. And it gives you some idea of the kind of mix of community that we are in North Kensington. A few lessons. I also want to tell you just about a few snapshots of one or two people as well. Some of the lessons that we've learned, and I think we are still learning lots of lessons, about being flexible and adaptable rather than having a plan. It'd be lovely to have a plan, but we have constantly had to react to events and sometimes to change our minds, as with anniversary planning and many other things, where we think we know what we're doing and then somebody else will tell us that we've got it wrong, and we actually have to stop and listen and realise, yes, we have got it wrong, actually. We sometimes think we know what to do, and it is a constant process of, even as we're telling other people to listen, we also have to listen to the local community as well, though it doesn't mean we always do what they want to do. Every year we have an All Saints service at my church because it's become a ritual, and how should I put it? I think I got asked to host an All Saints service. Some of the bereaved survivors come from a tradition where this is a common service. In the Methodist church, we don't do anything like this very much. We're fairly kind of low church and boring and plain. But people who have some knowledge of orthodoxy or Catholicism particularly will expect those things. And so a number of them had asked for an All Saints, All Souls service. They're not quite sure about which day is which, but they wanted something at the beginning of November. And of course expected the Methodist church then to deliver it. By service, what they mean is a kind of big concert with lots of people singing and doing all kinds of things in it. And we've just let that happen. And I dreaded the event. I don't think I'm particularly kind of liturgically fussy, but I dreaded what was going to happen at this uncontrollable, ramshackle, shambolic affair. And yet, the church was packed out with people, and those who came found it helpful. I've managed to rule out some of the more genuinely unorthodox, or indeed things that clearly would cross a line in terms of what I would regard as clearly pagan worship. But people have found, I've learned to actually relax and chill out and appreciate there is a spirituality in the community which is different from mine but needs to be tapped into, and I need to learn from that. And so we have this, well, mishmash of an event. Do come along if you want to experience it sometime at the beginning of November every year. But the flexibility is something we've had to learn, and I think I'm still learning. Relationships are the key thing. Relationships between faith leaders, but within the community. I was hugely helped by a number of things, being so new in the community when the fire happened, that I met local faith leaders who were very much known and trusted in the community, and I knew I could trust them. By a strange quirk, my sister happens to live very close to the church, has been living there for some time. And on the morning after the fire, she turned up at the church, and she's not a churchgoer, but knew lots of people in the area and acted as an interface for me, which helped me then get to know a lot of people very, very quickly in the community as well. And people see those relationships at work. I wouldn't say it happens every day, but I'm amazed at the number of times when I walk around the streets in a dog collar and people cross the road to greet me. Usually it's the other way around. They cross the road to avoid you, of course. But they cross the road to greet you. Many of them are Muslim. And they regard me as their minister. I am their priest, their vicar, their minister. And of course, so is Father Alan and Father Gerard and others too. It doesn't make them any less Muslim. And they regard our church as their church. In the same way, strangely, as I regard Al-Manar Mosque as my mosque, and I've been there on plenty of occasions too. Yesterday morning, just before our service began, one of the sisters from Al-Manar Mosque came to our church to express her condolence at what had happened in Sri Lanka, and wanted us to know of the Muslim community's prayers for Christians. Now, she didn't know whether we had Sri Lankans in our church. In fact, we don't. But there are many Methodist churches in London which do have a significant number of Sri Lankans in the congregation, and she simply wanted to offer that, as we had offered our prayers following the massacres in Christchurch. And we have good and warm and important relationships. One thing I've learned about trauma is that it makes everything worse. If you had a problem before the Grenfell Tower fire, it is amplified so much more by what you have gone through. And I think as soon as I feel I've begun to understand what trauma is about, and I'm no psychologist, I then realise how much more there is to learn. Because in some ways the trauma is still emerging in the local community, and we're still identifying new ways, I think, in which it is manifest, one of which is the huge amount of anger and frustration and impatience in the local community. But it's also about the fracturing of relationships that's going on, and about the reluctance until very recently for many people in the community to seek any kind of help as well. Because they knew that actually the people from Grenfell Tower were those who were most affected. So they didn't want to seek help if they had been living in the adjacent flats and had perhaps been made homeless by the fire. Many other people, 200 households in total, have been made homeless, not all of whom were Grenfell Tower. There were many flats adjacent to it which were also rendered uninhabitable by the fire, and let alone the trauma. And in an area such as North Kensington, which had a significant number of social problems, high proportion of people with mental health issues, for instance, it has made things much, much worse. So to give you one example of one chap I see frequently who was only just about coping before the fire. He's lived, I think, in 6 places since the fire, cannot settle anywhere, has a history of drug and alcohol abuse, and by and large since the fire has managed to stay fairly clean and fairly sober, but is utterly paranoid. And on Tuesday was telling me, in all sincerity, how he's desperately suicidal because he feels the local authority are trying to kill him. And he's absolutely genuine about that. He thinks they're out to murder him. And he sincerely believes that they didn't like the people in Grenfell Tower and they wanted them got rid of as well. That's the level of paranoia and suspicion that is there amongst some people, and trauma is clearly a big factor in that. We've been offering safe spaces, and I suppose one reflection I'd want to offer is about the importance of spaces where people can be sad and angry and just be themselves. And I think there's a big issue perhaps about hospitality and what that looks like for churches and faith centres to offer that in all kinds of places, whatever the situation happens to be. And one of the things that I've learned about hospitality is that it's not us offering something to a community. It's about a community saying, well, it's about a partnership. So we don't set the agenda and say, you can do this, but you can't do that, and you can do that, but you can't do that, and this is our plan. It's more about a community saying, we'd like to do this, but we're not sure how. And so we'll say, well, we'll actually try and sort this out together. Let's see what might be possible. So it's often about a journey together and about a partnership. There are risks, I would say, though, especially if any of you are church safeguarding officers or anything like that, about hospitality. So I don't want to imply any kind of undue casualness about it. As I've told some groups, on the Sunday morning after the Grenfell Tower fire, when our president of conference was coming to preach, she happened to be a local minister anyway, she came to preach at our church. The world's media are outside. It's a large church congregation, much larger than we normally have. And just before the service, one of the BBC security people comes to me, I've got to know him over the previous days, and announces to me that he's found cocaine in our toilets. Now, the president of conference assured me that it wasn't hers, of course, and we've never discovered whose it was. But there are, and I've never told the church that information. You know, how you can keep children safe, and we decided in the early days not to allow any children on site at all, because with so many people coming and going, we just couldn't have any way of offering any kind of protection. And we found that a number of people regard us as more trustworthy than agencies which, strangely, elsewhere are trusted. So, some people will prefer to have their counselling in a church than in a local clinic or hospital setting. It's regarded as safer, more secure, better ambience than a much more medicalised environment. We're regarded as more neutral, interestingly, because in the particular local politics of North Kensington, the NHS is not regarded always as neutral in these things. And so again, we're regarded as more, strangely, on the side of the people in these kind of matters. And for some of the conversations about screening, and one of the remarkable things that has happened in Grenfell Tower is that through the coroner and the police, I think, being incredibly flexible and accommodating, almost all those bereaved relatives and survivors who have wanted to have been allowed to go back into Grenfell Tower to see the places where they used to live, or to lay flowers or other mementos at the sites where their loved ones died. They'd have to be escorted by the police, by the psychologists, often by a priest or vicar or minister, someone such as me and other people. and there's a huge amount of screening because you have to wear all this kind of threefold, I've forgotten what the technical term is, but it's the suit that stops any kind of fibres or particles getting into you, and so that you are not contaminating the site or being contaminated by it either. You have to wear a mask and everything else. And what is the role of a church in helping people discover what truth looks like and what justice looks like, when many people locally have a very clear idea of that and are very clear that they have not had that recognised? And how do we help a local authority and a community where there is no trust actually be able to talk to each other and be heard well? Because there is a huge breakdown in trust locally. As I said, some people genuinely believe that the local authority was trying to murder them. And anything the local authority has said since has not been believed. And the resilience of some of those local authority officers who've gone to meeting after meeting for months and months and been shouted down time and time again, I think is extraordinary. Even as I've been critical of the local authority, I do think they have an incredibly difficult task in front of them. We're also aware that truth can be very, very complex. So, what do you say to someone who says, I want to know if the site is contaminated? As many people do. We've had a report that came out some months ago saying that this site is contaminated, highly contaminated, but didn't give details about the nature of the contamination or the levels of the contamination in an area of London which traditionally, of course, has high levels of toxins for all kinds of reasons, going back to it being London and building works that have happened there and heavy industry in the local area over decades and decades. So, is this contamination concerning or irrelevant? It's very hard to know these things. When a local authority, Health Service and Public Health England are saying just slightly different things. And when that happens, people say, we know we are being lied to, therefore. And it does feed conspiracy theories, especially in an age of social media. So anything that someone says in a meeting will get put onto Twitter and repeated at them time and time again afterwards. I can say more about that if you want to, but helping people to understand there may be more than one version of the truth without it not being true, I think is one thing that we might be able to contribute. Truth is not always black and white. There are shades of grey. There are different understandings which can be simultaneously valid, just as a person from Grenfell Tower can be Muslim and Christian in the same person, can be both African and Western in the same person, can be both traditional conservative and incredibly liberal secular in the same person. And I can certainly think of one person who fits all those descriptions. But sadly she perished in the fire. The future, and then I'll give you a chance for a breather. These are some of the issues, I suppose, that for us are on the agenda. Most people are in some form of permanent housing, but not everybody. And some people are being housed well and carefully and conscientiously by a local authority that is faced with a true nightmare of trying to house people with multiple needs at times, let alone the issues about the fire itself and the traumatic impact of that. But I met a lady a few weeks ago who was being rehoused. She wasn't in Grenfell Town, she was in a nearby flat. Has not been able to go back to the flat since the fire. She came here from Kosovo 20 years ago. You can imagine what was going on in Kosovo 20 years ago, perhaps. She came here with 2 small children. She now has 2 more. She is a single mum, and she has 4 children now, aged between about 11 and 25, something like that. And she's being rehoused in a flat, which is good for her and her 4 children, with no cooker. And she has the delights of universal credit to negotiate. So she cannot They can't cook anything, they have no microwave, so everything is expensive because they have to buy ready cooked food. And they don't have the resources, they don't have the deposit, they don't have any resilience, financial resilience to cope with those kinds of things. And fortunately, in the end, we managed to find some means of paying for the cooker just to get her back on her feet. That's not the case for everybody, I have to say. But instances like that are also not uncommon of people being treated in that way. We will be years down the line with the public inquiry and the criminal investigation, which leaves everybody locally feeling they're in limbo. It means the Grenfell Tower will not be dismantled. It means that many people are waiting for that to happen before anything else can take place. And much apprehension about what the findings might be. The level of community trauma, the concerns about contamination. So we have some people incredibly angry about contamination, worried about their children. And of course, in the 2 years since the fire, some local people have developed cancers. They have died of mysterious ailments. They have developed motor neuron disease, multiple sclerosis, all kinds of ailments, some of which people attribute to the Grenfell Tower fire. And of course, it's very hard to know the extent to which that might be true, or not, because people, an average section of the population would have had all kinds of ailments in the normal course of events. Is that because of the toxins in the air and asbestos? Or is it simply a factor of the stress that the community has gone through? Or is it perhaps not a factor at all? But I meet people, as I did 3 weeks ago, sitting outside the local hospital, sobbing, and I do mean sobbing, and saying, I'm so worried for my son, because this report has come out, I just do not know, what's going to happen. What's going to happen to him, he's 40, what's going to happen to him in the future. All his skin was horribly affected in the days after the fire, she said. I don't know the son, so I don't know what his skin was like. And she was not in the direction of the wind from Grenfell Tower, but her flat is fairly close. Was this something related to the fire? Is it irrelevant? I have no way of knowing, but her distress is very, very real. What's going to happen to the site? What's going to happen to the millions of pounds that has been so generously donated by many people, especially big organisations? Much of the money that was given to Methodist churches, I have to say, has already been spent and delivered to people on the ground, and I'm very pleased that it has been actually spent on things. But there are all kinds of long-term educational funds, but for many organisations locally, they cannot find legitimate ways of spending the money. That's going to be a problem in the future. And I think the whole set of partnerships which may come between the churches and the other faith organisations as a result of getting to know each other much more closely. And some of my best friends, the people I work closely, are some of the local Muslims, I have to say, whose hospitality has been humbling and overwhelming at times. On the first Friday after the fire, I was invited to the iftar at the end of the days of Ramadan fasting. I'm not sure why they invited me, and I didn't remember who had invited me. I simply know that I had to turn up at 8 o'clock outside the mosque in the street, and I was supposed to say a few kind words to them, which I duly did. We had been working at the church all day since about 5 or 6 in the morning. I had nothing to eat and nothing to drink like everybody else, and just before we knocked off shift at about 7:15, a few of the other people who finished said, look, we've finished now. Mike's going to go off to the iftar. We're going to go down the pub. Mike, if you want to join us just before we go to the iftar, that's fine. And in fact, the pub is on the way to the mosque. Genuinely, the pub is on the way to the mosque. So as I walk past the pub, 20 people say, "Oh, Becca," and have a drink. So I arrive at the mosque, having drunk a good couple of pints on an entirely empty stomach, and was really, really warmly and graciously received. I've never forgotten their generosity of welcome and graciousness. Just some of the issues that I think are raised, maybe for discussion later, issues about trust, where trust is so thin on the ground. about what it means to offer hospitality and to receive hospitality, about how we listen to people, especially when actually we find them, as I often do, wrong, but also right. Yeah. There's a wrongness that comes from my particular perspective, but there's a rightness that comes from their experience, which need, and we need to move between the language of right and wrong in terms of how we actually engage with people and how a local authority can actually regain a trust and learn how to listen genuinely to people and to offer the kind of respect and dignity that, for whatever reason, they feel they've not been afforded. And the whole issue is how we find new housing solutions in areas like North Kensington and perhaps more widely. I talked briefly about Mark introduced the social housing report, so if ever you want to look on Shelter's website, it is there. I'm glad to say some of the recommendations have already been implemented by the government, who I have to say I am impressed by in terms of their willingness to engage with some of the things that have been in the report and some of the things concerning social housing. It's not traditional territory for a Conservative government, at least not in recent decades, but I do detect a willingness on the part of a number of government ministers actually to recognise this is an issue that actually is widespread across the country. So the ending of no-fault evictions, which was announced only a few days ago, was one of the recommendations that we made, and I'm very glad that that's gone through. I'll leave you with that photo, not others. A picture of the silent march and many of the people walking through the streets, which happens every 14th. And perhaps it's a good way to finish at least this part on a kind of poignant note, because what they're trying to do is, in everything, remember this is about 72 people who lost their lives unnecessarily, and it was avoidable. And one day we hope that we can learn lessons from this and it will never happen again. I will stop there.
Sure. Absolutely brilliant and fascinating. I'm going to call a break of 10 minutes, so it's almost past. We'll start questions at 20 to 9, so do grab a drink if you like or nip to the loo.